Since its destruction in 70 AD by the Roman army, the exact location of where the Jewish temples once stood has been lost to the world. In the next few minutes, we'll examine biblical and historical evidence that help explain why finding the temple site has been so difficult. Our search for clues to the temple location takes place almost exclusively within the pages of the Hebrew Scripture. In order to understand why identifying the site's been so difficult, we'll also examine the writings of an eyewitness to the last temple's destruction. In the end, our search leads us to the amazing conclusion that the Jewish temples were actually located a third of a mile south of the Dome of the Rock, above the Gihon Spring. Before we dive into our search for the location of the Jewish temples, I thought it would be helpful to briefly examine the 1100-year history in which the temples stood from the time King David conquered Jebus until the Roman Emperor Hadrian renamed Jerusalem Alia. This brief overview will enable us to better understand why identifying the site of the temple has been so difficult. So let's take a quick peek. In 1003 BC, Jebus, or Jerusalem, was a fortress inhabited by the Jebusites living high atop Mount Zion, the tallest mountain in the area, which had deep valleys protecting the city. The Jebusites were so confident that no one could breach the city walls, they shouted down insults at David and his men, saying that even the lame and the blind could defend the city against him. An angry King David instructed his men to climb up a hidden water shaft to enter the fortress and defeat his enemies. After capturing Jebus, David changed the name of the fortress to the City of David and began enlarging his new capital. 37 years later, King David's son Solomon started construction on the first temple in 966 BC. 7 years later, in 959 BC, King Solomon completed the temple. In 586 BC, 371 years after Solomon first dedicated the temple, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and burned it down the temple. In 539 BC, 47 years after the destruction of the temple, the Persian king Cyrus issued the order for Jews in his kingdom to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. The king's decree included specific instructions for the temple size and height, and that it was to be located upon the site of the former temple. In 536 BC, Jews returning back to Jerusalem started construction on the second temple under the supervision of the Jewish prince Zerubbabel. 27 years later, in 516 BC, the second temple was completed. 71 years after Zerubbabel finished the second temple, Nehemiah rebuilt the wall around the entire city of Jerusalem in 445 BC. In 329 BC, the Greek king Alexander the Great took control of Jerusalem. 165 years later, Judah Maccabee temporarily ousted Greek forces from Jerusalem and purified the temple, establishing the first Hanukkah celebration in 164 BC. 24 years later, Judah's brother, the high priest Simon Maccabee, once again defeated the Greek army. The Greeks had recaptured the city and established a stronghold in King David's citadel, which towered over the temple complex. After vanquishing the Greeks from the citadel, also known as the Acra, Simon decided the only way to safeguard the temple from foreign desecration again was to destroy the citadel and level Mount Zion. The high priest spent 3 long years working day and night to level Mount Zion down to the bedrock and filled up the valleys with the fill from the mountain. Simon moved the city to the western side of the Cheesemaker Valley, which enlarged Jerusalem's overall footprint. Sometime between 140 and 137 BC, the high priest also moved King David's tomb to the new Mount Zion on the western hillside. In addition to moving Mount Zion, Simon also built a new fort on the northern hill above the temple, which he named the Barrass. Apparently, the Barrass was built to house Levite temple guards and protect the temple's northernmost flank from attack. 118 years later, King Herod the Great began enlarging the temple complex and rebuilt the sacred temple more in line with the height of Solomon's original one. The temple remodel began in 19 BC and took a total of 81 years to complete. Besides enlarging the temple complex, Herod also enlarged the Barras fortress and renamed it the Fortress Antonia, after his Roman friend Mark Antony. 8 years after the temple renovation completion, the Roman general Titus burned down the temple and the entire city of Jerusalem. Josephus reported the only thing the Romans left standing in the city was the Fortress Antonia in 70 AD. 52 years later, in 132 AD, the Roman Emperor Hadrian decided to rename the city Alia, and he made the temple site a garbage dump for his new Roman city. Why it matters. Before examining why the temple site was lost, it's important to understand why the issue matters today. Currently, most scholars and religious authorities of all faiths believe that the Jewish temples stood within the walls that enclosed the Muslim shrines, the Dome of the Rock, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Considered the second most holy site in the Islamic faith, the Dome of the Rock was built within the ancient wall structure known as the Temple Mount between 689 and 691 AD by the conquering Arab Caliph Abba al-Malik. The Caliph chose this spot because he believed it to be where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven during a mystical horseback journey with the angel Gabriel. Islamic authorities warn that any attempt to build or excavate within the Temple Mount walled area will result in a total war with the world's 1.5 billion Muslim believers. The same Temple Mount area is also the most sacred site in all of Judaism. The rebuilding of the final Jewish temple is prophesied in the scriptures of the Jews and Christians. Jewish devotion to the western retaining wall of the Temple Mount, or the Wailing Wall, is a testament to their belief that this area is where the temple was and will ultimately be rebuilt again in the future. A new temple must be built for the arrival of the Jewish Messiah, who will sit on the throne of his ancestor King David in the rebuilt temple. Jewish rabbis agree that the temple must be rebuilt on its original site. Taking into account the religious views of the Muslims, Jews, and Christians regarding the future of the temple site area, it's clear why God said Jerusalem would be a burdensome stone at the end of the age. There doesn't seem to be a way of reconciling the future of the Temple Mount area that doesn't end in a full-scale world war. That is, unless God has hidden from man's view his divine plan. In Book 7, Chapter 1 of his famous history, The Wars of the Jews, the ancient Jewish historian Flavius Josephus described the final battle of Jerusalem between the 10th Roman Legion and Jewish zealot priests. The battle ended in 70 AD with the entire city and the Jewish temple being completely destroyed. As an eyewitness to the actual events, Josephus recorded how Roman soldiers set fire to the temple and slaughtered its defenders, along with thousands of innocent people who were hiding in caves, sewers, and tunnels underneath the sacred complex. After the temple burnt, Roman commanders ordered survivors to dig deep under the ruins to recover any gold and silver that had melted into the ground from the great fire. All the foundation stones were dug up to recover the precious metals, completely wiping the temple complex off the face of the earth. According to Josephus, the destruction was so complete no one would have ever believed that a city had once stood on the site. Only the walls protecting the Roman camp were left standing. Finally, Josephus reported that the barbaric 10th Legion Roman soldiers
disemboweled many of the remaining survivors in an attempt to recover any hidden valuables swallowed by them. 60 years after these horrible events, the Roman Emperor Hadrian renamed Jerusalem Alia and made the temple site a garbage dump for his new Roman city. In a final insult to the rebellious Jews, he had a coin minted showing Jerusalem as a field being plowed, in recognition of the prophecy of the Jewish sage Micah, who had written,
"Therefore, on account of you, Zion will be plowed as a field, Jerusalem will become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the temple will become high places of a forest."
Now that we understand why identifying the site of the ancient temple of the Jews is so difficult, let's look for clues that might help solve the mystery. The location for the first Jewish temple that was built by Solomon was chosen by the angel of the Lord and revealed to King David. The strange events that led up to the site selection are described in the Bible books 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles chapter 21 verses 14 through 30 describe how the angel of the Lord was sent to punish Israel for David's prideful sin of taking a census of the fighting men under his command. The destroying angel had killed 70,000 men and was about to slay those people living in Jerusalem when God heard David's repentant prayer and spared the city. King David saw the angel standing on the threshing floor of Arnoth the Jebusite when God ordered the destroyer to stop the plague. The angel told King David's prophet Gad to build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor. And shortly after this, he announced that the Lord's temple was to be built on the same spot. So where exactly was the threshing floor of Arnoth the Jebusite? Seems obvious that in order for Arnoth to be a Jebusite, he had to live in Jebuz. Jebuz is described in 2 Samuel chapter 5 as the location of the fortress of Zion that King David had conquered 30 years prior to buying the threshing floor from Arnoth. So here the Bible gives us a clue as to where Jebuz was located. The fortress of Zion, or the walled city of Jebuz, was conquered by David's men who climbed up a water shaft to enter the fortified city. Interestingly, there is no water shaft on the Temple Mount. However, a water shaft has been found. In 1867, the British explorer Sir Charles Warren discovered a water shaft that dates back to the time of King David. The water shaft, now known as Warren Shaft, is a third of a mile south of the Dome of the Rock in the area known as Sawan, or the City of David. The shaft Warren discovered runs 55 feet vertically from the floor of the Kidron Valley at the Gihon Spring to a spot on the Sawan hillside. Apparently, the shaft was used to bring water up from the Gihon Spring, which is the only fresh water spring within miles of Mount Zion. Fresh water was vital to Jewish priests as they purified themselves and their animals during temple ceremonies. For example, 1 Kings states that during Solomon's temple dedication, over 144,000 animals were sacrificed, which required an enormous amount of water to clean and wash away the blood and other waste of these sacrifices. So here we have an important clue about the location of Jebuz. It had a water shaft that was used by David to enter the citadel or the fortress of Zion. You know, it seems fair to assume that Warren Shaft is the X that marks the spot of David's entrance into Jebuz. What other Bible clues are there? Well, here's a big one. The second chapter of Nehemiah states that the gates of the citadel, or the city of David, were next to the temple. Now, if the citadel was on the same ground that included Warren Shaft, we must conclude that the temple was located next to Warren Shaft. There are more clues in this book of the Bible. The story of the ancient prophet Nehemiah is very fascinating. Nehemiah was a Jewish captive and the favored cupbearer for the ruler of the ancient world, the Persian king Artaxerxes. Nehemiah heard a report from a family member that the remnant of survivors who had returned to Israel were in trouble, and that the walls of Jerusalem were in ruins. After hearing the bad report, Nehemiah asked and was granted permission from the king to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls. Nehemiah chapter 3 describes the prophet's detailed account of rebuilding the wall around the entire city in 445 BC. Here we have the best description of Jerusalem in the entire Bible.
Nehemiah 3. Eliashib the high priest and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set its doors in place, building as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated, and as far as the Tower of Hananel. The men of Jericho built the adjoining section, and Zaccur son of Imri built next to them. The fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hasenaa. They laid its beams and put its doors and bolts and bars in place. Meremoth son of Uriah, the son of Hakaz, repaired the next section. Next to him, Meshullam son of Berechiah, the son of Meshezabel, made repairs, and next to him Zadok, son of Baana, also made repairs. The next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. The Jeshanah gate was repaired by Joiada, son of Paseah, and Meshullam, son of Bezodiah. They laid its beams and put its doors with their bolts and bars in place. Next to them repairs were made by men from Gibeon and Mizpah, Melatiah of Gibeon and Jadon of Meronoth, places under the authority of the governor of Trans-Euphrates. Uzziel, son of Harahiah, one of the goldsmiths, repaired the next section, and Hananiah, one of the perfume makers, made repairs next to that. They restored Jerusalem as far as the broad wall. Rephaiah, son of Hur, ruler of half-district of Jerusalem, repaired the next section. Adjoining this, Jedaiah, son of Haramoth, made repairs opposite his house, and Hattush, son of Hashabneiah, made repairs next to him. Malchijah, son of Haram, and Hashub, son of Pahath-Moab, repaired another section in the Tower of the Ovens. Shallum, son of Halohesh, ruler of a half-district of Jerusalem, repaired the next section with the help of his daughters. The valley gate was repaired by Hanan and the residents of Zanoah. They rebuilt it and put its doors with their bolts and bars in place. They also repaired 1,000 cubits of the wall as far as the dung gate. The dung gate was repaired by Malchijah, son of Rechab, ruler of the district of Beth Hakerem. He rebuilt it and put its doors with their bolts and bars in place. The fountain gate was repaired by Shalun, son of Kol-Hoseh, ruler of the district of Mizpah. He rebuilt it, roofing it over and putting its doors and bolts and bars in place. He also repaired the wall of the pool of Siloam by the king's garden as far as the steps going down from the city of David. Beyond him, Nehemiah, son of Azbuk, ruler of a half-district of Beth-zur, made repairs up to a point opposite the tombs of David, as far as the artificial pool and the house of the heroes. Next to him, the repairs were made by the Levites under Rehum, son of Bani. Beside him, Hashabiah, ruler of the half-district of Keilah, carried out repairs for his district. Next to him, the repairs were made by their fellow Levites under Benui, son of Henadad, ruler of the other half-district of Keilah. Next to him, Ezer, son of Jeshua, ruler of Mizpah, repaired another section, from a point facing the ascent to the armory as far as the angle of the wall. Next to him, Baruch, son of Zebai, zealously repaired another section, from the angle to the entrance of the house of Eliashib the high priest. Next to him, Meremoth, son of Uriah, the son of Hakaz, repaired another section from the entrance of Eliashib's house to the end of it. The repairs next to him were made by the priests from the surrounding region. Beyond them, Benjamin and Hashub made repairs in front of their house, and next to them, Azariah, son of Maaseiah, the son of Ananiah, made repairs beside his house. Next to him, Benui, son of Henadad, repaired another section, from Azariah's house to the angle and the corner, and Palal, son of Uzai, worked opposite the angle and the tower projecting from the upper palace near the court of the guard. Next to him, Pedaiah, son of Parosh, and the temple servants living on the hill of Ophel made repairs up to a point opposite the water gate toward the east and the projecting tower. Next to them, the men of Tekoa repaired another section from the great projecting tower to the wall of Ophel. Above the horse gate, the priests made repairs each in front of his own house. Next to them, Zadok, son of Immer, made repairs opposite his house. Next to him, Shemaiah, son of Shechaniah, the guard at the east gate, made repairs. Next to him, Hananiah, son of Shelemiah, and Hanan, the sixth son of Zelophh, repaired another section. Next to them, Meshullam, the son of Berechiah, made repairs opposite his living quarters. Next to him, Malchijah, one of the goldsmiths, made repairs as far as the house of the temple servants and the merchants, opposite the inspection gate, and as far as the room above the corner. And between the room above the corner and the sheep gate, the goldsmiths and merchants made repairs.
So, what can we glean from Nehemiah's extensive description of the long-lost wall of the ancient city? What clues are still here? First, there's the Pool of Siloam, which is still there and gives us a strong starting point to work from. To get to the pool, one had to enter the nearby Fountain Gate, which was next to the Dung Gate. The Dung Gate was 1,500 feet south of the Valley Gate. But here's where the trail goes cold because all the landmarks north of the Valley Gate are gone. But headed in the other direction from the pool, Nehemiah mentioned stairs coming down from the city of David. Recent excavations in the area have unearthed stairs on the north side of the pool. The text also mentions an artificial pool in the same passage. Several years ago, utility contractors digging in Siloam for a sewer line found a large man-made reservoir close to the Pool of Siloam. These finds certainly fit the Bible's descriptions. Following the narrative, the next area we can locate is the Water Gate, which was the entrance to the Gihon Spring. Nehemiah describes the Water Gate, the Upper Palace, the Great Projecting Tower, and the Wall of Ophel as all being next to each other. Now it's interesting that verses 20 through 26 tell us that the temple servants were living on the hill of Ophel, and just south of the Water Gate was the house of Elisham the high priest, alongside the upper palace of the king. It's very important and enlightening that Nehemiah's description has the high priest, the temple servants, and the king all living next to the Gihon Spring. This brings to mind the first chapter of the book of Numbers, verse 53, where God commands the Levite priest to live immediately next to the traveling temple or tabernacle. None of the other Israelites were allowed to live close to the tabernacle. The Levite priests were keepers of the temple and the only ones allowed to perform ritual duties required in Hebrew sacrificial services. And what about the upper palace mentioned in these verses? 2 Chronicles chapter 8 verse 11 describes this palace and how King Solomon built it and brought his wife, Pharaoh's daughter, up from the city of David to live there. Solomon built this palace at the same time he built the temple. It was located just north of the citadel, or the city of David. The 32nd chapter of 2 Chronicles, verse 30, reinforces the location of the citadel by describing how King Hezekiah built a tunnel to bring water from the Gihon Spring to the west side of the city of David. This water channel, known as Hezekiah's Tunnel, is one of Jerusalem's most popular tourist attractions today. It runs underground from the Gihon Spring to the Pool of Siloam, just as the Bible describes. So let's take stock of what we discovered so far about the temple location. First, regarding why the location is so difficult to identify, an eyewitness to its destruction, Josephus, stated that the temple was burnt to the ground and had its foundations dug up by the Roman 10th Legion in 70 AD. Second, Josephus described the destruction of Jerusalem as so complete that no one would have ever believed that a city had once stood on the site. He reported that the only thing left standing was the walls of the Roman fortress Antonia. Regarding what the Bible says about ancient Jerusalem and the temple site, first, David and his men conquered the ancient city of Jebus, or the fortress of Zion, by climbing up a water shaft to enter the fortress. The water shaft was rediscovered in 1867 at the Gihon Spring by Sir Charles Warren. After defeating the Jebusites, David renamed the fortress of Zion the City of David. The Bible also uses the term the citadel to describe the fortress. 30 years later, the angel of the Lord told David to build an altar on the threshing floor of Arnoth the Jebusite. David's son Solomon built the temple on this spot. Following the book of Nehemiah's description of Jerusalem in 486 BC, we learn that the temple was built next to the gates of the citadel. Nehemiah also states that the king's upper palace, the house of the high priest, and the temple servants all lived next to the water gate located at the Gihon Spring. 2 Chronicles tells us that King Hezekiah built an underground tunnel from the Gihon Spring to channel water to the west side of the city of David. From these clues, we've identified a water shaft, the area of the fountain gate at the Pool of Siloam, stairs on the north side of the pool coming down from the direction of the city of David, and an artificial pool next to the Pool of Siloam, and the whereabouts of the water gate and the Ophel next to the Gihon Spring. Of course, we've also found Hezekiah's tunnel on the west side of the citadel, or the city of David. And finally, we've got a pretty good idea of the general location of the Dung Gate and the Valley Gates of the ancient city of Jerusalem as well. To this point, all the evidence, including an eyewitness to the destruction of the city and the Bible's specific details about the landmarks of the holy city, indicate the land immediately surrounding the Gihon Spring as the temple site, not the walled area housing the Muslim shrines. What else do we know about the Gihon Spring? Perhaps the most telling incident reported in the Bible regarding the area of the Gihon deals with the coronation of King Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 1 tells the story of David giving the order to the prophet Nathan to take his son Solomon to the Gihon and have the high priest Zadok anoint him king over Israel.
1 Kings 1:38-39. So Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah son of Jehoiada, the Kerethites and the Pelethites went down and had Solomon mount King David's mule, and they escorted him to Gihon. Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the sacred tent and anointed Solomon.
Why the Gihon for this ceremony? Because King David had set up the sacred tent there housing the Ark of the Covenant next to the altar he had made at the direction of the angel of the Lord. The tent and the ark were at the Gihon. But why did the angel of the Lord choose the Gihon in the first place? It's important to realize that all rituals performed by the temple servants and the high priest required fresh water. For example, Exodus chapter 30 verse 10 describes God's requirement that the high priest first bathe with fresh water before he could even put on the sacred robes. This is just one example of the Mosaic purity laws that required pure running water. As we previously mentioned, the Gihon was the only source of fresh running water within miles of Jerusalem. It seems clear that the shaft David's men used to enter the fortress of Zion was the conduit the priests used to access the fresh spring water of the Gihon Springs for their ceremonies. Let's consider these additional facts. After Solomon started building the temple, he had a huge water tank called the Brazen Sea built for use in temple ceremonies. 2 Chronicles chapter 4 states that this tank was placed in the southeast corner of the outer room of the temple for priests to wash themselves. This tank is described as being 15 feet wide and 8 feet deep and able to hold 2,000 baths of water. Scholars believe that a bath was a unit of liquid measure that was equal to about 6 gallons. This means that over 12,000 gallons of water were needed to fill the Brazen Sea tank every day to meet the biblical requirement for fresh water. Now, with that number in mind, it's very difficult to imagine priests carrying that amount of water over a third of a mile uphill every day to the side of the Dome of the Rock. Remember, the traditional site has no access to the Gihon's waters, and this has to be taken into account in trying to accurately locate the real temple location. Which brings us back to the area immediately above the spring at Warren Shaft. If this X marks the spot, how did priests manage to bring up 12,000 gallons of water through Warren Shaft every day? One clue might be the Bible's description of the base the brazen sea tank set upon. According to the 7th chapter of 1 Kings, the huge water tank stood on 12 brass oxen, with 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The sea rested on top of them, and their hindquarters were towards the center. Perhaps the oxen represented the power used to bring up the water from the shaft using some manner of elaborate pulley system. We don't know, but it certainly seems like a reasonable hypothesis. Another explanation for how the water was brought up from the floor of the Kidron Valley to the brazen sea tank is the natural pressure of the Gihon Spring itself. Interestingly, the word Gihon means to burst forth, which is a perfect description for the spring. You see, the Gihon Spring is one of only a handful of siphon springs known to exist in the world today. This unique type of aqua system source of water comes from a higher mountain reservoir that fills up several times a day and sends a gushing torrent of water flowing down from a higher elevation so forcefully that it shoots water up in a volcano-like fashion. Geologists speculate that the source of the Gihon's water is most likely an underground river that flows into a subterranean cavern located in the northern elevation of the Mount of Olives. When the cavern fills up, it overflows and creates a natural siphon that drains downhill forcefully into the Gihon Spring and water shaft. Currently, the waters of the Gihon are up 3 to 5 times a day in the winter, twice in the summer, and once a day in the autumn. These eruptions, however, are not strong enough to bring the spring water all the way up Warren Shaft. However, over time, it's believed earthquake activity may have altered the intensity of these eruptions. Geologists and historians tell us an earthquake in 1067 AD was responsible for making the Gihon Springs water bitter. If this is correct, it's reasonable to assume that the seismic shift in bedrock may have changed the level of the Gihon's geyser-like eruptions as well. It may be that both the Gihon's daily eruptions and additional force provided by oxen were the means used by the Levite priest to fill the brazen sea tank up every day. Hopefully, someday scientists will settle on a conclusive answer. For now, what we know for sure is that Warren Shaft is a missing piece of the puzzle that fits the Bible's description of the route King David's men used to enter the fortress of Zion. We also know that the Gihon was the source of water used by Jewish priests for temple rituals. There simply wasn't another fresh running water source available. There's one very important clue from the book of Nehemiah that seems to absolutely confirm the location of the temple in 445 BC. In chapter 12, verses 31 through 40, Nehemiah describes the dedication ceremony of the rebuilt city walls and gates. Nehemiah wrote,
I had the leaders of Judah go up on top of the wall. I also assigned 2 large choirs to give thanks. One was to proceed on top of the wall to the right, toward the dung gate. Hoshai and half the leaders of Judah followed them, along with Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shimei, Jeremiah, as well as some priests with trumpets, and also Zechariah, son of Jonathan, the son of Shimei, the son of Mattaniah, the son of Micaiah, the son of Zakur, the son of Asaph, and his associates, Shemaiah, Azarel, Milalai, Gilalai, Mai, Nethanel, Judah, and Hanani, with musical instruments prescribed by David, the man of God. Ezra, the teacher of the law, led the procession. At the fountain gate they continued directly up the steps of the city of David on the ascent to the wall and passed above the site of David's palace to the water gate on the east. The second choir proceeded in the opposite direction. I followed them on top of the wall, together with half the people, past the Tower of the Ovens to the broad wall, over the gate of Ephraim, the Jeshanah gate, the fish gate, the Tower of Hananel, and the Tower of the 100, as far as the sheep gate. At the gate of the guard they stopped. The 2 choirs that gave thanks then took their places in the house of God.
So here Nehemiah tells us that the first group of priests walked south around half of the city and ended up at the water gate, which was the entrance to the Gihon Spring. Then he describes the second group of priests heading in the opposite direction and ending up at the gate of the guard. Now this gate of the guard was located next to the upper palace where royal prisoners were often kept. For example, this is where the prophet Jeremiah was kept locked up by King Zedekiah.
This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord in the 10th year of Zedekiah king of Judah, which was the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. The army of the king of Babylon was then besieging Jerusalem, and Jeremiah the prophet was confined in the courtyard of the guard in the royal palace of Judah.
Let's remember, in Nehemiah chapter 3, the wall-building prophet described the courtyard of the guard as being next to the upper palace, which was next to the water gate. So you see, after each group walked around half the city, with one winding up at the water gate and the other at the gate of the guard, then both groups of priests entered directly into the temple, from the water gate and next to the water gate, which was the entrance to the Gihon Spring. These verses plainly describe to us that the temple was next to the water gate at the Gihon Spring.
Keeping all of these puzzle pieces in mind, let's now turn our attention to the walled structure located a third of a mile north of the Gihon Spring that houses the Islamic shrines, the Dome of the Rock, and the Alaska Mosque. If it's not the temple site location, what is it? Masada, 74 AD. In 74 AD, after Rome destroyed Jerusalem and burned down the temple, a group of Jewish zealot rebels calling themselves the Zachari made a last stand against Rome's 10th Legion. The Zachari managed to hold off the Roman army for over 3 long years in a hilltop compound built by King Herod. That compound was Masada, a mountaintop fortress overlooking the southern end of the Dead Sea, located about 30 miles south of Jerusalem. Apparently, the rebels believed they could withstand the Roman army from the mountaintop fortress, but eventually the 10th Legion finished a massive earthen ramp and reached the walls of the fort with a giant battering ram. The night before the Romans breached the walls, the rebels decided to commit suicide rather than fall into the hands of the brutal Roman soldiers. When they breached the walls, the Romans were shocked to find 960 dead Jewish rebels. Only 2 women and 5 small children were found alive. The story of the siege at Masada has become a national symbol of pride and determination, inspiring modern Jewish people to live free in their own land. So much so that upon entering military duty, many new IDF soldiers are taken to Masada and told the story of the siege. It's truly one of Israel's most cherished historic sites. So, what does all this have to do with our search for the temple location site? The only historical record of the events that happened at Masada come from Josephus' writings in the War of the Jews, Book 7, Chapter 8. Hidden in the story of Masada is the record of the final speech of the leader of the Zachari, Eleazar ben Yair. His impassioned speech convinced almost 1,000 Jewish rebels that there was nothing left to live for because of the destruction of their holy city. One of the Jewish survivors of the siege told the Romans what Ben Yair had said to convince 960 Jews to kill themselves.
And where now is that great city, the metropolis of the Jewish nation, which was fortified by so many walls round about, which had so many fortresses and large towers to defend it, which could hardly contain the instruments prepared for the war, and which had so many 10,000s of men to fight for it? Where is this city that was believed to have God himself inhabiting therein? Is it now demolished to the very foundations, and hath nothing but that monument of it preserved? I mean the camp of those that hath destroyed it, which still dwells upon its ruins. Some unfortunate old men also lie upon the ashes of the temple, and a few women are there preserved alive by the enemy, for our bitter shame and reproach. Now who is there that revolves these things in his mind, and yet is able to bear the sight of the sun, though he might live out of danger? Who is there so much his country's enemy, or so unmanly and so desirous of living, as not to repent that he is still alive? And I cannot but wish that we had all died before we had seen that holy city demolished by the hands of our enemies, or the foundations of our holy temple dug up after so profane a manner. But since we had a generous hope that deluded us, as if we might perhaps have been able to avenge ourselves on our enemies on that account, though it now become vanity, and hath left us alone in this distress, let us make haste to die.
Here we're very plainly told that the only thing left standing in Jerusalem in 74 AD was the camp of those who destroyed the city, not the wall that protected the sacred temple complex of the conquered Jews, the camp of those who destroyed the city. That camp was the Roman fortress Antonia, built by Herod the Great and named in honor of Herod's Roman friend Mark Antony. It makes no sense whatsoever to believe that the Romans would have destroyed everything in the city, including their own camp, but leave the walls protecting the most meaningful building of the Jews standing. What makes perfect sense was for the Romans to leave a symbol of their victory towering over the smoldering ruins of the defeated Jews' holy city. Obviously, the Romans left an exclamation point for all to see, and it's still there today. The 10,000 stones that comprise the walls surrounding the Islamic shrines on the Temple Mount must be the monument Eleazar spoke of. These walls date back prior to 74 AD, and they're the only large man-made structures that survived the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. It's important to note here that in Eleazar's speech he stated that the foundations of the Holy Temple were dug up by the Roman army. Now, there's no evidence of any excavation like that ever taking place within the walls of the Temple Mount area. Clearly, if the Romans dug up the foundations of the sacred temple, it happened somewhere other than the Temple Mount area, whose foundation stones remain intact.
The majority of evidence presented in our study comes directly from the Bible books Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Exodus, and 1st and 2nd Samuel. All books considered sacred writings by devout Jews and Christians and the most reliable sources for information about the Jewish temple and their histories. Some of the non-biblical evidence presented in this video comes from the writings of the ancient Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who was a witness to the events surrounding the last temple's destruction by the Romans in 70 AD. That being said, it's important to acknowledge that some consider Josephus an unreliable historical source. And here's why. In Josephus' own writings, he admits to befriending and eventually becoming a protege of the Roman general Titus, the same Titus whose troops destroyed the last Jewish temple. So we have to ask ourselves, are the doubters right? Let's briefly look at the facts. Josephus was a Jewish priest and a military officer who was captured by the Romans, and in his own writing stated that he came to the conclusion the only way for his people, the Jews, to survive was to accept the yoke of the Roman rulers or face extinction. Eventually, he became a slave to General Vespasian and was granted Roman citizenship when Vespasian became emperor. He was a translator and a friend of Vespasian's son, General Titus, whose job it was to put down the Jewish rebellion centered in Jerusalem. Working as an advisor, a translator, and a historian for the Romans made him a traitor to the Jewish rebels and hated by most of his own people up to this very day. In spite of this hatred, even Jewish scholars have to agree that the books written by Josephus are the most often quoted and referenced historical writings dealing with this time period. I've found in my own work over the past 20 years of studying many scholars who loathe him that they still quote him when trying to make a point. So, specifically, with regard to Josephus' writings about the temple,
and the circumstances surrounding its destruction, we have to ask the question, are they accurate, and should we believe them? When he wrote about the witness testimony of the final speech made by Eleazar ben Yair, the leader of the rebels at Masada, is it credible? My belief is that there's not a good reason for him to have made up a false report. He stated that the only building left in Jerusalem after the Romans burnt the temple was the Roman fort. So we have to ask, why would he lie? You wouldn't write something that your Roman benefactor would read and know it wasn't true. What? Well, what would be the upside of making up such a story? Now, I guess people who question his accuracy would argue that he wrote the account for propaganda purposes to make Titus look more victorious. I don't see how the story of almost 1,000 Jews killing themselves to keep Rome from having a victory over them and enslaving them in any way makes Titus or Rome look good. In fact, the story actually makes the Romans look bad. I believe you just can't have it both ways here. If you really accept the shocking tale of Masada, you're going to have a difficult time dismissing the part about where Eleazar says that the only thing left standing in Jerusalem is the Roman fort. Remember, the only record of Masada comes from Josephus' account here. Finally, it's important to point out that Josephus' Masada story has actually been backed up by a lot of archaeological evidence found on top of that mountain in the desert. So that's why we've included his writings in our search for the temple location. So I wanted to take a brief moment and explain why I got involved with a very controversial subject of the temple location in the first place. For several years I'd been working on a film about writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The film is about three brothers who each became the Jewish high priest several hundred years before Jesus' ministry began. As part of my work, I had been building miniature movie sets, including many of the visuals you saw in the film. After completing a scale model of the temple complex based on the dimensions recorded in Ezra chapter 6, I began building a topographical model of Jerusalem to place my temple model on. With the aid of tools like Google Earth, I started measuring geographic landmarks and building a grid map system to help me accurately locate where I could place the temple scale model. This is when things got very complicated. Like most folks, I had believed that the temple was located on the hill somewhere within the Temple Mount complex, which I later found out the Arabs call it Haram es-Sharif. After many weeks of trying to produce an accurate design for my model of Jerusalem in 170 BC, I realized that things didn't fit using today's landmarks alone to accurately locate where to place my temple model complex. So I went back to the only true and reliable source on the subject, the Bible. As I mentioned in the film, the best description of ancient Jerusalem in the entire Bible, or for that matter anywhere else, is the description of the city walls in the book of Nehemiah chapter 3. So I plotted out Nehemiah's description of the wall and the landmarks he described in telling the story of rebuilding the wall around the entire city. Much to my surprise, Nehemiah's narrative didn't seem to jive with the temple being located within the Haram walls either. So I became very frustrated and began looking for less orthodox possibilities. That's when I was very fortunate enough to stumble onto the amazing research of Dr. Ernest L. Martin. Dr. Martin had been a well-respected archaeologist who had led years of excavations near the western wall of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Among his many accomplishments, he was also the chairman of the Department of Theology at Ambassador College in Pasadena, California, before his untimely death in January 2002. Of the numerous books and papers authored by Dr. Martin, His book, The Temples That Jerusalem Forgot, held the answer I'd been looking for. A theory that fit Nehemiah's description of the walls of the ancient city Jerusalem. Within the 485 pages of his extraordinarily well-documented study of the history of the Jewish temples, Dr. Martin presented evidence from a great number of obscure historical documents, as well as some well-known ones like Josephus' writings, that wove a convincing case for the temples actually being located above the Gihon Spring and not within the walls of the Haram al-Sharif complex. I should point out here that after 20 long years of researching information on the Dead Sea Scrolls, I've learned that when reading scholarly work on a subject, it's very important to always check the author's source documents rather than just accepting the author's final conclusions. This keeps you from going down a lot of bias-ridden rabbit holes. So this is what I did with some of the major points from Dr. Martin in this book. I read the quoted source material, and although some of his readings on the material can be interpreted slightly differently, by and large I found him to be spot on some very critical points. Thank God for his footnotes. Anyway, let me just say this. It's impossible to give even a small review of the overwhelming evidence Dr. Martin presents in his extraordinary study. If the subject interests you, get a copy of his book and visit the website dedicated to his work, www.askelm.com. For me, and the map I was working on, there were two critical clues about the temple from Dr. Martin's book that filled in some missing puzzle pieces. First, Dr. Martin presented a passage from Josephus that described two 600-foot-long bridges that connected the Roman fortress Antonia with the northwest corner of the temple compound built by Herod. The second puzzle piece dealt with a description of ancient Jerusalem as being quarter moon shaped. As you can see, when I added the information together with my Nehemiah description map, it fit. And I was startled by the fit. I dove deeper into a study, and the results of which you're watching now. After fitting my Nehemiah map together with the information from Dr. Martin's research and determining that it looked fairly conclusive, I still felt the need to somehow find a biblical landmark to make sure of the northern border. You see, as we mentioned in our presentation, all the landmarks north of the Valley Gate area on the western side of the city and north of the Watergate, Wall of Ophel area on the eastern side of the city are no longer there. I needed something to confirm a northernmost point of the ancient city. You see the Sheep Gate, the Inspection Gate, the Tower of 100, the Tower of Hanel, the Broad Wall, all these things were wiped off the map by the Romans. So anyway, I turned to my biblical concordance and did a word search looking for verses that mentioned these areas, and that's when I found my landmark. You see, in the New Testament book of John, chapter 5, verse 1, the Apostle John tells the story of Jesus healing a beggar at the pool of Bethsaida. John described the pool as being located outside the Sheep Gate. Well, having traveled to Jerusalem many times, I knew that the pool of Bethsaida has been historically located in an area on the northern side of the Haram complex, which seemed to deal a fatal blow to my theory. But as I've come to find out about God's favorite city, things aren't always what they appear to be. Looking at my map of Nehemiah's wall, I knew if the northern border was actually below the Haram, there had to be a pool of some kind outside or on the north area designated as the Sheep Gate on my map. So once again I turned to Google Earth, and sure enough, there where it was supposed to be is the remains of an ancient pool. For me, my Rosetta Stone landmark.
As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you."